The room felt different when Marcus walked in. Sarah noticed it immediately, that subtle shift in the emotional atmosphere, the way conversations quieted, how people unconsciously straightened their posture. She'd always been sensitive to these things, but lately, her perceptions had become surgical in their precision. 6 months after her empathic awakening, Sarah could see the psychological choreography playing out in real time. Marcus commanded attention not through charisma, but through a kind of emotional vacuum that pulled everyone's focus toward him. And there, orbiting around him like planets around a star, were the helpers, the fixers, the sensitive ones who seemed magnetically drawn to his need. Sarah recognized the dance because she'd performed it herself for years. The unconscious tango between the person who felt everything and the person who felt nothing they could admit to. Jung had warned about this exact dynamic nearly a century ago, but what he discovered was far more disturbing than simple attraction. He realized that empaths and narcissists don't just find each other by accident. They're drawn together by the most powerful force in psychology, the need to complete their missing pieces. And what Sarah was about to understand would change everything she thought she knew about her own journey from unconscious absorption to conscious mastery. This is the story of Jung's most chilling discovery about projection, shadow work, and why the empath-narcissist dynamic represents both the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity for psychological individuation. Act 1. The Magnetic Trap. Jung first observed this pattern in his Zurich practice around 1915. His most psychologically sensitive patients repeatedly found themselves in relationships with individuals who displayed what would later be recognized as narcissistic traits. What he discovered shook his understanding of human psychology. These weren't random attractions. They were unconscious psychological exchanges, shadow projections so precise they operated like magnetic forces. Here's what Jung observed: the empath carries the emotional life for both people in the relationship. They feel the narcissist's suppressed shame, vulnerability, and terror of abandonment, but experience these as their own emotions. Meanwhile, the narcissist unconsciously projects their inner critic, their harsh judgment, their impossible standards onto the empath. The empath then internalizes this voice, becoming hypervigilant about their own worthiness, constantly questioning their perceptions, perpetually trying to prove they deserve love. Jung realized he was watching two incomplete people create one dysfunctional system. The empath provided the emotional processing capacity the narcissist couldn't access. The narcissist provided the decisive action and boundary setting the empath couldn't claim. Together, they formed what Jung called unconscious complementarity, each carrying the other's disowned qualities of the self. Picture this in your own life. Maybe you've been the person who could sense exactly what your partner needed before they even asked, while they seemed naturally able to handle confrontation and make tough decisions you avoided. It felt like perfect teamwork until you realized you were doing all the feeling for both of you. The perfect mirror effect. What made this dynamic so insidious was its initial effectiveness. In the early stages, both parties felt more complete than they'd ever felt before. The empath finally felt protected and valued by someone who seemed strong and decisive. The narcissist finally felt understood and validated by someone who could sense the deeper needs without them having to reveal vulnerability. Jung documented how empaths in these relationships would describe feeling seen for the first time, not realizing they were actually being used as emotional processing centers. They were being seen, but not for who they were, for what they could provide. The narcissist, meanwhile, experienced the empath's emotional availability as proof of their own specialness. Here was someone who would prioritize their needs, absorb their emotional volatility, and never challenge their self-image. The empath became what Jung termed the perfect mirror, reflecting back only what the narcissist wanted to see while absorbing everything they wanted to disown. But Jung observed that this symbiosis came at a devastating cost. The empath gradually lost access to their own emotional center, becoming so focused on managing the narcissist's internal world that they forgot they had one of their own. The narcissist, meanwhile, became more defended and less capable of genuine intimacy, using the empath's emotional labor to avoid facing their own psychological development. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you could predict and manage someone else's moods better than your own? Where their emotional stability became your primary responsibility, while your own feelings seemed to disappear entirely? That's the empath carrying someone else's disowned emotional life while losing their own. Act 2. The Shadow Exchange. The empath's disowned shadow. For the empath, their shadow contained everything they'd been taught was unacceptable in someone who was supposed to be caring and sensitive. Their shadow held their anger, their selfishness, the deep need to prioritize their own well-being, and most crucially, their power, their ability to say no without explanation, to set boundaries without guilt, to trust their perceptions even when others disagreed. Think about the last time you wanted to say no to someone but found yourself saying yes instead, then resenting them for asking. That's your power sitting in your shadow, waiting to be reclaimed. Jung observed that empaths had learned early that accessing these shadow qualities made them bad people. So they projected all of this unacceptable material onto partners who seemed comfortable with power, anger, and strong boundaries. The narcissist's disowned shadow. For the narcissist, their shadow contained everything they'd learned was dangerous to acknowledge: their vulnerability, the deep terror of being truly seen and found wanting, their dependence, the desperate need for validation and emotional regulation from others. Most crucially, their tenderness, their capacity for genuine empathy and authentic connection. Maybe you recognize this pattern from the other side. The partner who seemed too emotional, but somehow you felt calmer around them because they were expressing all the vulnerability you couldn't let yourself feel. Jung noted that narcissists had learned early that showing vulnerability invited attack, that expressing need led to abandonment. So they projected all of this dangerous material onto partners who seemed comfortable with feeling, needing, and being vulnerable. The empath became the container for everything the narcissist couldn't allow themselves to experience. The unconscious contract. Jung realized that empaths and narcissists entered into what he called an unconscious contract. The empath agreed to carry the narcissist's emotional life in exchange for protection and the illusion of being special. The narcissist agreed to carry the empath's power and boundaries in exchange for emotional regulation and validation. Neither party was consciously aware they'd made this deal. Both believed they were in love, that they'd found the perfect complement, their missing piece. But Jung could see the psychological mechanics at work. Each was using the other to avoid facing their own individuation work. The relationship functioned like a psychological drug. The empath got their fix of feeling needed and valuable. The narcissist got their fix of feeling admired and in control. Both got to avoid the terrifying work of integrating their own shadow material. Act 3. The breaking point. Jung observed that the breaking point in these relationships typically occurred when one party, usually the empath, began to individuate despite the relationship's resistance to growth. This often happened during what he called clarity events, moments of such profound betrayal or invalidation that the empath's survival instincts finally overrode the conditioned programming. Sarah's clarity event came when she discovered Marcus had been having an emotional affair with another colleague, someone he described to Sarah as needy and unstable. In that moment, she realized she was seeing her own reflection in his description. The very qualities he criticized in the other woman were the same ones he exploited in Sarah. But what made this a true clarity event wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the sudden recognition of the entire psychological pattern. Sarah could see how she'd been carrying Marcus's emotional material, how he'd been projecting his harsh judgment onto her, how their entire relationship was built on the unconscious exchange of shadow material. Jung noted that these moments of recognition were often accompanied by what he called projection recall, the sudden return of all the psychological material the empath had been carrying for the other person. The empath would suddenly feel the narcissist's rage, their shame, their terror, their criticism as distinctly separate from their own emotional experience. The individuation fork. Jung observed that clarity events created what he called an individuation fork, a moment where the empath had to choose between psychological growth and psychological safety. They could return to the familiar pattern of absorbing projections and maintaining the relationship's equilibrium, or they could begin the terrifying process of returning projections and reclaiming their own disowned qualities of the self. If you've ever had a moment where you suddenly saw your entire relationship with crystal clarity, not just what happened, but the whole psychological dance you'd been performing for months or years, you know this fork. That instant where you realize you can never go back to not seeing what you now see clearly. Most empaths, Jung noted, chose safety, but some empaths chose growth. They began what Jung called conscious projection recall, the deliberate process of identifying which emotions, thoughts, and reactions belonged to them and which they'd absorbed from others. Sarah chose growth, but it nearly broke her. As she began returning Marcus's projections, he escalated his attempts to re-establish the old dynamic. His unconscious system was panicking because his emotional processor was going offline. Meanwhile, Sarah was confronting her own shadow material. She had to face the anger she'd been suppressing for years, the selfishness she'd been denying, the judgment she'd been projecting onto others. Act 4. The divergence. Jung observed that relationships in shadow storm typically resolved in one of two ways: collapse or transformation. The determining factor was whether both parties were willing to reclaim their own disowned qualities or whether they insisted on maintaining the projection system. In collapse scenarios, the relationship ended with both parties convinced the other had fundamentally changed. The empath would find another narcissistic partner and recreate the same dynamic. But for empaths who successfully individuated through the relationship crisis, Jung observed remarkable transformations. They developed what he called projection immunity, the ability to recognize and refuse other people's emotional projections. Sarah discovered she could still sense Marcus's emotional states with perfect clarity, but she no longer absorbed them. She could feel his anxiety without becoming anxious, recognize his criticism without internalizing it, perceive his emotional needs without feeling responsible for meeting them. This is what returning projections actually feels like. You can still sense everything you always could, but now you know the difference between their emotions and yours. You feel their anxiety as information about their state, not as something you need to fix or absorb. This wasn't coldness or withdrawal. If anything, Sarah became more genuinely empathetic because she wasn't drowning in projections. She could offer authentic compassion for Marcus's struggle without losing herself in it. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah began attracting completely different types of partners. Her projection immunity acted like a filter that repelled individuals looking for someone to carry their emotional life and attracted people interested in genuine psychological intimacy. Jung called this the authenticity magnetism effect. Integrated empaths naturally drew people who valued emotional honesty, personal responsibility, and mutual growth. Act 5. The resolution and ethical choice. The shadow master choice. Jung observed that empaths who successfully individuated often faced an ethical dilemma. Should they use their enhanced psychological insight to help others trapped in similar dynamics, or did that risk creating new forms of codependency? Sarah discovered she could spot empathic narcissistic dynamics with startling accuracy. She could predict which colleagues would get drawn into toxic relationships, identify the manipulation patterns in her friends' marriages, and see the projection systems in her family's interactions. But she also realized that trying to rescue others from these patterns could recreate her old empath role on a larger scale. She could become addicted to being the person who sees clearly and helps others escape dysfunction. Jung's guidance was clear. Integrated empaths should use their insights primarily for their own continued growth and secondarily to support others who were genuinely seeking individuation. They should never use their psychological clarity to control outcomes or force others to grow. Maybe you've lived this choice point. You see the projection patterns everywhere now, in your family, your workplace, your friend group. The temptation to become the psychological rescuer, the one who explains everyone's patterns to them, can be overwhelming. Sarah learned to offer her insights when asked, set boundaries around emotional support, and trust others to do their own individuation work. She became what Jung called a conscious mirror, someone who reflected back psychological truth without absorbing emotional material or taking responsibility for others' growth. The ripple effect. Jung observed that when empaths individuated through narcissistic relationships, they created ripple effects that extended far beyond the personal healing. Their refusal to accept projections forced everyone around them to become more psychologically honest. Family members couldn't use Sarah as an emotional dumping ground anymore. Colleagues couldn't manipulate her into absorbing workplace dysfunction. Friends couldn't project their relationship problems onto her for solving. At first, people were confused and sometimes angry about Sarah's new boundaries. But over time, many began developing their own emotional processing capacity because they no longer had Sarah to do it for them. Jung called this the individuation cascade effect. When one person in a system individuates successfully, it creates pressure for others to individuate as well. The revolutionary conclusion. Jung's final warning. In his later writings, Jung included a warning that has proven remarkably prescient. The greatest danger for the conscious feeling type is not their sensitivity to others, but their potential for psychological manipulation once they understand the projection mechanism. Jung realized that empaths who successfully individuated possessed almost supernatural abilities to understand others' psychological patterns. This gave them enormous potential for both healing and harm. The difference was not in the capability but in the intention. Integrated empaths who used the gifts in service of individuation, both their own and others, became forces of psychological evolution. Those who used the gifts to maintain specialness or control outcomes became sophisticated manipulators. Every integrated empath eventually faced what Jung called the shadow master choice. Will you use your psychological insights to heal or to harm? Will you become a servant of individuation or a master of manipulation? The evolutionary potential. Jung's final insight was perhaps his most hopeful. These relationships, when navigated consciously, represented humanity's potential for psychological evolution. The empath's natural gift for emotional perception combined with the narcissist's natural drive for achievement could create extraordinary partnerships when both parties did their individuation work. Together, conscious empaths and individuated narcissists could become what Jung called complementary individuated pairs, couples who supported each other's continued growth while maintaining their own psychological wholeness. But Jung emphasized that this outcome required both parties to choose growth over comfort, truth over flattery, and individuation over projection. Your shadow projection awareness. The empath-narcissist dynamic isn't just about romantic relationships. Jung observed these projection patterns in friendships, family systems, workplace dynamics, and therapeutic relationships. Wherever there's an unconscious exchange of shadow material, there's potential for both psychological harm and evolutionary growth. If you've recognized yourself in this dynamic, whether as the empath, the narcissist, or someone who's played both roles, Jung's research offers a revolutionary reframe. You're not broken, damaged, or doomed to repeat dysfunctional patterns. You're participating in humanity's attempt to integrate shadow material and evolve psychologically. The question isn't whether you've been caught in projection patterns. The question is whether you're ready to use those experiences as individuation opportunities rather than remaining trapped in unconscious complementarity. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. Your attraction to narcissistic partners wasn't evidence of poor judgment. When properly understood and consciously integrated, these experiences become your pathway to psychological mastery and authentic intimacy. The only question remaining is, are you ready to return what isn't yours and reclaim what is? Because the world doesn't need more unconscious projection exchanges. It needs more conscious individuals who can relate authentically without losing themselves in others' shadows. Comment, I return what isn't mine, if you're ready to transform unconscious absorption into conscious choice, projection into clarity, and codependency into authentic empathy. And if you want to learn how to spot these projection patterns in real time and stop carrying someone else's disowned qualities of the self, subscribe now, because our next deep dive into Jung's most practical shadow work techniques will give you the exact tools to reclaim your psychological wholeness.